Hi guys, I'm Kasha. Welcome to the channel and welcome as always to our coffee times. Today, another Friday, another Fear Street movie. I was extremely excited today because part 2 was potentially for me going to be the best part of the trilogy. So of course I had to watch it. I wrote down all my thoughts on the movie and we're here to talk about it spoiler free.
It's coffee time!
So I considered to wear my Stephen King t-shirt for this video because there is many direct references to Stephen King, the one and only, but I decided that Camp for Beginners would be a more suitable t-shirt to wear for this video. Before we dive into part 2 that takes place in 1978, if you're new here, please consider subscribing if you love horror movies, horror collectibles, and also click the notification bell before you leave. So if you missed my first video, I recommend you to go back and watch it. My spoiler-free review of part 1 that takes place in 1994, because I do give a small intro about the books and where the idea of the Fear Street movies came from. And after you check that one out, come back here so that we can discuss part 2, or as I like to call it, A Tale of Two Sisters. Fear Street Part 2 1978 is an American slasher movie and direct sequel, of course, to Part 1, based in 1994 by the same director, Leigh Janiak, and it's also the second movie in the trilogy that will end next Friday with Part 3, 1666. The adaptation of the Fear Street books actually started already back in 2017, and already Leigh was hired as a director for the 3 movies that were going to have originally a theatrical release. They were going to be released in the cinema, but because of everything that happened and the movies not being able to go to the cinema in June 2020 when it was planned, they decided to move it to Netflix and release a movie per week, as they wanted to do anyways in the cinema. And for me, I think that was a great idea because not everybody has access to the cinema right now, so it is a great way of giving people the opportunity to watch the trilogy everywhere in the world where you can get Netflix. Now let's dive into the movie. We are in 1978 in Camp Nightwing, that is divided by the campers and the counselors who hail from the prosperous town of Sunnyvale, and the campers and maintenance staffers from the downtrodden town of Shadyside. But when the horrors from their own town's shared history come alive, they must band together to solve a terrifying mystery before it is too late. Even though in this trilogy we know that we're going back in time, actually this movie starts right after the events of part 1, so we take off right where we left it, and we see a woman in her living room watching the news, and she hears about the tragic deaths that just happened in Shadyside and receives a phone call from one of our survivors from part 1 asking her for help. Why her? Because she is Cindy Berman, the only survivor after the attacks at Camp Nightwing. We already had this information from the first movie, but now we are actually being introduced to Cindy Berman and we start to hear her story. As expected, we are getting a 70s slasher in a summer camp with a lot of the things that come with that. We are also retaking the investigation of the mystery of this witch that is supposed to be responsible for all of the crimes and all of the deaths that have been happening through the years in Shadyside. Of course, and as we expected, this movie feeds from other franchises like Friday the 13th, or from movies like Sleepaway Camp, so slashers from the past like the first one did, feeding from movies like Scream. So I absolutely love to see that because they're doing it on purpose, and it actually works because they're not really copying those movies, but they're still giving us elements from those old classics that we all love. So If you're familiar with these summer camp slashers, you know probably that there are something that also tends to happen in these movies, which is sex before marriage. So like in those movies, we are getting here an R rating movie, but not just because of the blood and the gore, also because we are really going to get to see some sex scenes in this movie, and these things were not like this in the books. The books don't have like sex scenes, they don't have so much gore, and also they don't have any swearing. So basically this trilogy is kind of taking it a little bit more into the adult part of things, so the books were very mild compared to the movies. Now, the movies have a lot of elements that are connecting them together, and even though for the second part they used a similar formula, it is different in a lot of ways, including the tone of the movie. And in this movie, we also see a group of teenagers with their teenage angst that realize that there has to be some sort of curse that has been put in this town by this witch, and that is why people are getting killed in Shadyside, and they also want to try to solve this mystery and find out more about the legend of Sarah Fier. Now, the name of Sarah Fier is something that is explained in the books, how that actually influences the name of Fear Street, but I'm not gonna explain everything right now because I'm not sure if they're going to go into detail in part 3 or not. If they don't, then I can explain it to you in my next video next week. I just don't want to spoil anything in case that they do address that in the last movie. The soundtrack of this movie is chef's kiss, on point. Absolutely loved it so much. And you know, sometimes in movies, when you combine the songs and the lyrics that they're singing with the scenes that you're seeing, it can be a little bit corny, but I just think that it worked so well in this movie. I actually love to see it when it's done right, and it's when it's the right type of movie to do that. For me, my favorite song for this movie was Blue Oyster Cult, Don't Fear the Reaper. Absolutely love that song, and I absolutely loved it. Also, Carry On My Wayward Son. It always reminds me of Supernatural, but yeah, like I said, the sound in general in the soundtrack in these movies is just top-notch. I also really enjoyed the camera work in this movie because it really reminded me of some of those shots from some older slasher movies, and the camera is kind of hovering, kind of floating through and letting you see characters that you don't know if they're gonna die yet or maybe later, but you kind of have the feeling that their destinies are already written and that they're all gonna die, mostly because we already got some information on the first movie that most of the people of that camp are not gonna make it out alive. Now let's go to talk about the characters. So why did I say at the beginning that this movie for me could be called A Tale of Two Sisters? It's because the main strong relationship in this movie that makes it work so well is exactly that, a relationship between two sisters. In 1978, Ziggy, a character played by Sadie Sink, which I love, is a camper in Camp Nightwing, and the counselor there, one of the counselors, is her older sister Cindy, and we're going to see kind of a typical tropey story, you know, two sisters that are kind of having their own differences, but when danger comes around, they have to stick together and fight for survival. One of my favorite characters here was definitely Siggy. I thought that the intense performance by Sadie Sink was great, and I love also a lot of the different vibes that the movie had, not just the slasher camper movies, but a little bit of Carrie as well. We are also going to meet Nick Good, that we already know actually from 1994, where he is a sheriff, and here in the camp he is another camp counselor. So you're going to be able to see some characters that we already met when they were older, since we are going back in time. In this movie there is a lot more effort into describing the rivalry between Sunnyvale and Shadyside, which which basically they're all built in the same territory, but at some point they decided to split it into two different towns, and that's where the rivalry kind of started. But they both have a common enemy, which is Saraphir. When it comes to the plot, this one I feel like it's less intricate than the first movie. It is a lot more straightforward, and we are still exploring the legend and the myth of Saraphir. And same as in the first movie, she takes the body of a teenager and uses him as an axe-wielding man to come and slash and kill all the other teenagers, as she already kind of did in the first movie. She just takes over the body of somebody, and without them knowing what they're doing, they are basically killing their friends. But we already knew about these Axemen because we already got the information from the first movie, which is one of the dangers when you are trying to do something so bold as to tell a story backwards, because a lot of the information and a lot of the flashbacks that we saw already in part one are kind of taking away the thrill sometimes, because we know that there's only going to be one survivor in this movie, or very few of them, and one of them is going to be Cindy. So we know that her character is safe the whole time, which, you know, every time they are trying to put her in danger, it doesn't really work because you already know that she's going to be safe. Even though the second part can be considered less fresh, less unexpected, because a lot of information that we see here is something that we already knew from the first part. However, the tone in general of the movie was, for me, better, because we are leaving behind the 90s with their flashing colors and the bright lights, and we are going into a lot of darkness in this movie. We are getting to see most of the time our characters in the dark, and there is a lot of fear in the sense that the characters are trapped there, we are trapped there with them, and there's many scenes that are shot in ways that makes you feel like claustrophobic. And I really love the tone and the atmosphere that this movie had. It was, in my opinion, less campy than the first one, even though from a summer camp you expected a little bit more of those cliches, but we didn't get as many as I thought. Series writer and director Leigh Janiak focused kind of on expanding a little bit the universe, telling us a little bit more about Saraphir, also really getting into the characters, and I think that is one of the strong points, the strong suits of this trilogy is the characters. Normally in slasher movies, the characters are just disposable and they're just there for the fun, the blood and the gore, but in this trilogy the characters are there to connect with the viewer. They're smart, they're fighting back, they're not just scared waiting to be killed. These are characters that have a purpose, they want to find a solution. So it feels like a way that, you know, in slashers normally characters are not being taken seriously, and in these movies they are, and it kind of changes a little bit the dynamic. So in these movies the killings are not the most important part of the movie, but the relationships between the characters. So it is not about teens getting slaughtered, and it is not about finding out who is behind the mask, because we know who the real killer is here, and that is Saraphir. When it comes to the horror, I do feel like this movie offered a lot of killings, a lot of blood. I was satisfied. However, nothing is going to top that visceral, fantastic death from the first movie. I'm assuming you guys have watched it, so here's a spoiler with the bread slicer. I love that death so much. It was unexpected, it was fantastic, absolutely loved it. I don't have a special favorite death from this movie, but nonetheless, if you're here for the scares and for the slasher part, you're also going to get what you're looking for. In this second movie, you're going to have to wait though a little bit longer to get to the first kill, because they are really trying to build up the story and the characters at the beginning a lot more than they did in the first part. But it didn't bother me at all because I am here for the characters. At least they're giving us a more complex story than just a slasher. So they're kind of giving us a mystery combined with a slasher, and I'm here for it. So in the end, I decided to give this movie a 4 out of 5, which is half a point more than I gave to part 1. The reason being is that the tone, the darkness of this movie was a lot more to my liking than the first movie, and I thought this one was a little bit more serious, a little bit less campy than the first one, and I really love that as well because there are not too many slashers out there that are also taking their characters seriously and that are giving us such great atmosphere apart from kills. So for me, I really enjoyed this part a little bit more. However, I still think that both were great movies, and it is not easy to tell the story of Fear Street in just 3 movies and also tell it backwards. I think I also enjoyed this part more because I loved that dynamic between the 2 sisters and how they came together to fight, and I also love to see the elements that were combining part 1 and part 2 and things that reminded me of part 1, kind of like parallels that happened. And of course the movie ends giving us a glimpse of what's to come in part 3, 1666. I did watch a full hour interview with the director, and she mentioned that probably part 3 is going to be the most brutal, so I'm here for it. And also she mentioned there is a scene in part 3 that is going to be really intense. She says that a horror video game that she was playing had a very disturbing scene and she got the idea from that. So I'm here for it. I'm really excited. We still have to wait 1 full week. But anyways, you guys, I think I talked too much today, but I hope you enjoyed the spoiler-free review. You can tell I really loved part 2. Let me know down below which one has been your favorite, part 1 or part 2. And are you excited or as excited as I am for part 3? Let's talk Fear Street in the comments. Thanks so much, you guys, for watching. Please give the video a big thumbs up for support. And I hope to see you all guys, as always, in our next coffee time. Bye!